Welcome to Living Mirrors with Dr. James Cook. My guest this week is Michael Pollan. Michael is a journalist and author and is currently the Knight Professor of Science and Environmental Journalism at the UC Berkeley Graduate School of Journalism. He's written several books on the social and cultural impact of our relationship with the natural world, including The Botany of Desire and The Omnivore's Dilemma. In 2018, he wrote How to Change Your Mind, a best-selling book on the current renaissance in scientific research on psychedelics. Today we talk about psychedelics and our relationship with the natural world. Hope you enjoy the conversation. Okay, I'm here with Michael Pollan. Michael, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Oh, good to be here, James.
So before you started writing about psychedelics, you'd previously written a lot about our kind of engagement with the natural world. Do you see a kind of through line from that work to your work on psychedelics?
Yeah, psychedelics are part of our engagement with the natural world. Most of them are produced by plants or fungi, and we've been using them for a long time. I've always been interested in the human-plant relationship and the symbiosis that goes on, or the coevolution, and how we use plants to satisfy various desires. And one of those desires, and one of the most curious, is the desire to change consciousness. And whether you're talking about coffee and tea, or peyote, or even LSD is basically produced by a fungus, even though it has to be derived from that. And I've always found this a very curious thing about us as a species and about the plants who produce it. How incredible is it that a plant can produce a chemical that acts so specifically on a receptor in the human brain that to produce a substantial change in consciousness? How did that happen? Why did the plant do that? So those questions have been with me for a long time. And back in 2001, I published a book called Botany of Desire, where I specifically looked at the plant-human relationship through this lens of what are the plants doing to change us, even as we're changing them. And I looked at cannabis there as the model. And ever since, I've been curious about psychedelics. So when I started hearing about this research a couple of years ago, things going on at Johns Hopkins, Imperial College, NYU, I thought, well, this is a chance to get back into that area and explore this whole phenomenon of consciousness change using plants and fungus.
Right. Yeah. And you mentioned this kind of idea of coevolution that you write about in The Botany of Desire. And I think with psilocybin mushrooms, something I find fascinating is the potential there that there's some kind of coevolution going on, as to why they kind of have this lock and key kind of mechanism, to activate these circuits in our brain. And yeah, I was kind of wondering about your thoughts on that, because I was expecting that to maybe be a huge part of the book, which it wasn't in the end. But do you have any thoughts on the possibility of that?
Yeah, I couldn't get a lot of solid information about that. I mean, we definitely have spread psilocybin. It's very easy to spread mushrooms. I mean, I found that when I was mushroom hunting with Paul Stamets. He said at one point that the indicator species for psilocybe azurescens is the Winnebago, the campers, and that you find most of them near where people are parked. And so that's because we're trailing spores behind us whenever we move mushrooms around. But to what extent did the mushroom become, was it selected for its, intensity? I don't think we know that for sure. It's not like, say, the tomato, which got bigger and redder under our, watchful eye. It may be true. Certainly we see that with cannabis, that cannabis, the plant, has had such intensive horticulture applied to it that it's, modern hybrids are substantially different than the wild forms of cannabis. But whether you can say that about mushrooms or not, I'm just not sure. I think they did have a big effect on our species in one way or another. I'm not sure I buy the stoned ape theory. I've just never been kind of convinced that those kind of changes would find their way into the human genome. I mean, I tend to think the impact of psychedelics is more in the realm of cultural evolution. I know you can't completely separate the two, but I do believe that there are very important cultural memes that have been introduced by this combination of these molecules and human minds. And that every now and then, I mean, the term I use in talking about it, or I did in Botany and Desire, and in this new book I'm working on, is that powerful drugs like psychedelics are a kind of mutagen in the realm of culture rather than biology. In the same way, radiation is a really disruptive force that leads to mutation, contributes to variation, that every now and then really benefits the species. Psychedelics is doing something similar in human minds, and giving people visions that give them ideas. I mean, who knows if the idea of an afterlife or an unseen world or the Platonic ideal, that there is an ideal version of a cup next to the cup. These, could seem plausibly psychedelic ideas to me. And religion may owe a huge debt to psychedelics. It's very hard to prove, because we also do have dreams, of course, without drugs. And we have those kind of visions, but there is an authority to psychedelic visions, that the noetic quality, as James called it, speaking of the mystical experience, that convinces people these things are real. And you could see how someone would have a kind of mystical experience and be dying to tell everybody about it, and would speak about it, as if it were written on stone tablets, it just would have that kind of concreteness. So, but, Paul Stamets and others and Terence McKenna, really believed that the influence was, that the mushrooms, consumption of mushrooms on the savanna exerted a true selective force and contributed to language. And McKenna has this interesting idea that language is a special case of synesthesia, which we do know is associated with psychedelic experience. But I just don't understand how it gets into the genome.
Yeah, I agree that the stoned ape theory, the idea that was introducing psilocybin mushrooms into our diet was the thing that made us different to other animals. I agree that I can't quite see how that happens.
I looked at this question of what accounts for the explosion in the size of the human brain when I was writing a book called Cooked a few years ago. And there's a more compelling thesis that it was cooked food that actually led to these changes, in that when you cook your food, it takes less metabolic energy to digest it. And you're basically externalizing that process in the fire. And at the same time, you don't need as much intestinal length, and you don't need as big a gut. So you can give energy that used to go to the gut to help you digest difficult food. It can go to the brain. And so that it's called the cooking hypothesis. It was put forward by Richard Wrangham, anthropologist at Harvard. And he's done really cool experiments in his lab of feeding animals on cooked food versus not cooked food, and there's just so many more calories that they get when the food is cooked. So I find that more persuasive for the growth of the giant brain.
Yeah, I mean,
there's a lot of romanticism in the psychedelic space.
Yeah, that was the kind of mainstream, the textbook kind of explanation that I was taught when I was studying to be a neuroscientist. That the idea that fire acts as a kind of external stomach. You're kind of pre-breaking it down, and then you can just get a lot more energy to the brain.
It's much more efficient, yeah. And it's not necessarily eating meat, because if you eat meat without cooking it, you don't get these benefits. But it's the cooking piece. So anyway, these are all somewhat just so stories. I mean, it's very hard to pin them down.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to these kinds of memes that you were talking about, changing our relationship to nature is a big one that comes along with psychedelics, kind of ecological consciousness. And for me, I always found it tempting to link that to the way that psilocybin mushrooms tend to thrive in disturbed ground that maybe humans have disturbed. And to me, it seemed like, well, I can absolutely imagine evolution stumbling on a trick to rein us in. As these kinds of primates start to dominate nature, it just finds the right kind of chemical key, because mushrooms are making chemicals all the time and acting on animals, whether it's through toxins, whatever. And that they are genuinely evolved to have this effect on us. But then I spoke with Dennis McKenna about this kind of stuff, and he was emphasizing the fact that these are really ancient molecules that also act on insects, and it kind of left me feeling like maybe that's a bit of an anthropocentric view to think it's all about us.
Yeah, and you have to be careful of that in all these coevolutionary arguments. Most of these alkaloids that have such a powerful effect on us began as defense chemicals. Basically, the goal was to keep from being eaten. There's a theory about psilocybin that it's about competition with insects for the same detritus, and that the psilocybin basically, one of the things psilocybin does, and it's true of other alkaloids, is ruin your appetite. And so if you expose an insect to some psilocybin, they're going to get distracted from sitting down to have a meal. And a theory I play with in this new book is that if you're in the business of producing defense chemicals to keep from being eaten, you probably don't want to be lethal, because if you're lethal, you'll be selecting for resistant members of the pest population. What would be a better strategy is to discombobulate, confuse, intoxicate your pest. If you're an insect and you're intoxicated, you're more likely to have a bird come pick you off, or forget what you're doing. And I tell the story in, I think this was in Botany of Desire. I had a fenced garden, vegetable garden, and in there I kept a catnip plant for my cat Frank. And every evening when I went to harvest something for dinner in the summer, he would follow me down into the garden. He loved catnip, but every day I had to remind him where it was. The catnip had gotten him so fucked up that he forgot where it was. That's a brilliant strategy on the part of the catnip.
Yeah.
So messing with the minds of your predator is a good strategy. But it began, it probably began with other species than us. And then we just kind of found it useful. Caffeine is an interesting example because it is a defense chemical. It's toxic to certain insects, and also it has an allelopathic effect. If the soil around caffeine is very hard for other plants to grow in. But then some plants, and this research was only done a couple of years ago, actually make caffeine in their nectar, which is not where you want a defense chemical. And it turns out they've repurposed caffeine as an attractant, and that honeybees really like a little bit of caffeine. And if they get it, they'll remember and be more faithful to the plant that gave it to them and return there more often. So essentially, caffeine makes them more effective pollinators, as it makes us more effective workers. So the purpose, I know we shouldn't use the word purpose when we're talking about evolution, but the function of a given thing gets repurposed all the time. And that may be true with psychedelics.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point on the caffeine example, and especially with psychedelics, that the trip isn't in the molecule, right? Caffeine isn't inherently stimulating. It's this kind of, I guess, to understand why it has that effect, you have to really look at the network of nature and see where these interactions are happening. And so things can absolutely be repurposed and have completely different effects in different organisms. And I think this kind of ecological or networked view of nature, I wanted to ask you about kind of these states of ego dissolution, and you mentioned the Hopkins work that kind of started your interest in this, looking at getting kind of overcoming fear of death in cancer patients. To me, I kind of, sometimes people talk about this as if it has a kind of supernatural flavor, that people have identified some kind of soul in themselves that will survive death. But I kind of argue for like a naturalistic view of these insights, where they are valid, but it's kind of like you're seeing yourself as part of this ecological web of nature that will survive the death of the individual. Do you have a particular kind of, having gone through these states as well, where do you sit on this kind of spectrum from naturalistic explanations through to more supernatural?
I tend to be on the naturalistic side of things, and I agree that there's a kind of reconceptualization of who you are, what the self is, and that I remember this woman who had cancer, and she was she a cancer patient? Yes, she was a cancer patient, and she'd had a very powerful psilocybin experience where at one point she went into the soil herself, however she managed it. She was going all over the world, but she ended up in the soil, bump up against the wall of a crematorium, and her body got taken up by the plants. Her cells or her elements. And of course, that is what happens. That is a naturalistic thing. That is what happens to the self after death. What was different is she could identify with every cell and every, carbon atom in her body. And so there was a continuity that most of us know exists. Are, the elements of which we're made don't go away when we die. They get repurposed. But most of us don't identify with that. We don't, we're so disconnected from our body, and that seems so abstract. But for some people on psychedelic journeys, that becomes quite real and quite vivid. The other thing that's happening, though, is people are having a rehearsal of death. They're feeling, ego dissolution is a kind of death rehearsal, and it doesn't feel so bad. In fact, it can feel ecstatic. And now it's a death rehearsal with a twist. It's a rehearsal, and people come back from it. And that may not be true of real death. But I think there's some comfort in that too. Just, in the same way our consciousness is constantly running scenarios, right? Practicing various things, courses of action. This is a really good scenario for dying. And I think having gone through it, it loses a little bit of its terror, or a lot of its terror for some people.
Right. And then am I right, it was your first psilocybin experience where you kind of had this flavor of connecting with nature when you're out in your garden?
Yeah. Yeah, this was a trip I had in my garden many years ago that was unguided. And, I've always felt connected to plants. I've written about them. I have a lot of respect for their subjectivity. I see them as having a subjectivity, not in the sense of having a consciousness the way we do, but having a point of view, having goals, survival, reproduction, and that we tend to see them as more inert than we should, or more passive. But this was kind of an intellectual conceit, and it certainly informs the Botany of Desire, that, the subtitle of which is a plant's eye view of the world. Now, plants don't have eyes, they don't have views, but they do have a perspective. They do have an angle on things, and a set of, basic goals. But during the course of this trip, which was quite powerful, I was in my garden. I was walking down this garden path with borders on both sides, and the plants in my garden were clearly returning my gaze. They were very aware of me. I was very intensely aware of them, and we were forming this interesting little community. And I had never been so kind of viscerally aware of their subjectivity as I was, and I felt very connected to them. They were totally benign and friendly, so that was so that was a powerful experience. I don't know what kind of veracity it has. If there's plant consciousness, it's so different than ours. It's almost impossible to conceive of it. But we have trouble conceiving of animal consciousness, but they are, they're acting on us. The plants in my garden are acting on us. They repay my attention with their beauty or their fruits or their vegetables. And it's just feeling in relation. And what was so wonderful about that experience is that, most of us don't feel part of nature. Or at best, we feel we have one foot in, one foot out. We talk about having a relationship to nature. I mean, that makes no sense at all. We are nature. We are in nature. To say you have a relationship means you're a discrete being relating to another discrete being, but that's not actually what it is. But that's what it is in our minds. And that has to do with egotistical thinking. I mean, the fact that most of us believe we're really the only subject. These other people, they probably have subjectivity also. But in fact, we can objectify them very easily, especially if they're different from us. And so we go through life, with a very impoverished view of all the different subjectivities around us, and that we are one of many. And so in this experience, I felt very much part of nature, and more part of nature than I had ever felt. And this kind of experience chimes with some research that's been done, around nature connectedness. Robin Carhart Harris has done this at Imperial College, and there's of course the psychologists have a scale for every damn thing, but nature connectedness is like, how much do you feel you're in nature or outside of nature? And a single psychedelic experience on psilocybin raises nature connectedness scores. Now, that's a really small sample, and there's a lot of selection bias with people in psychedelic experiments. They're all willing to take psychedelics, and those people, I would imagine, are kind of more well-disposed to environmentalism in the natural world than not. So it remains to be seen if you give psilocybin to, the Koch brothers in the United States, or some kind of like environmental criminal, whether you would get the same, or Trump, whether you get the same kind of change. It may well be that psychedelics intensifies inclinations you already have rather than changing them. So there's a lot of exciting work still to be done. But I'm not sold that that's a universal quality of psychedelic experience. I am sold that ego dissolution seems to be, and that when the ego dissolves, various walls come down. And one of those walls is this wall that puts us at a distance to nature. But, social walls come down, spiritual walls come down. And that in the experience of losing your ego, you're more likely to credit other subjectivities of all kinds.
Right. Yeah, I think I completely agree. And also, I would argue that it's kind of, science shows us that that's a step in the direction of seeing reality more clearly. You could imagine like, oh, I had a weird experience. I thought a plant was talking to me and it was just some kind of crazy experience. But I think we come back from these experiences, and so in my own academic work, I think that I'm arguing that if you try to understand consciousness and intelligence as coming from the brain and from some kind of, detached self, you're going to get confused. It leads us with these kind of insoluble problems. As soon as you understand it as coming from nature and seeing us as nature, it makes a lot more sense. So I think it allows you.
But wait, would you elaborate that a little bit? In what sense can we think of consciousness as coming from nature? I'm very interested in that.
Yeah, so my own work around this is proposed something called the living mirror theory of consciousness, which is arguing that consciousness arises from it's a feature of the life process, basically. It's not inherently a feature of brains. It's deeply associated with brains and creatures like us, but that we shouldn't mistake that correlation for the causation. And so it's really embodied organisms surviving that brings awareness, experience, consciousness, whatever word you want to use, brings it into existence. So as you say, a plant's consciousness will be very different to ours. It won't have language, it won't have the same kind of concepts, but there would be a feeling tone. There would be the lights would be on. They're not just, rocks might just tumble with no feeling, but a plant has some subjectivity. And
is this inherent in matter?
No, so this is not a kind of panpsychism, right? Is this popular idea at the moment that consciousness is everywhere? So this is that consciousness is very much emergent. The lights were off for the longest time, and then the idea is kind of, if you look at the thermodynamics of being a living system, you kind of, you're not created by someone else. We can create a machine and we can put in the principles that allow it to propagate itself. But a living organism needs to kind of pull itself up by its bootstraps. And I think I'm arguing that that process is one where consciousness kind of comes into existence as a way for you to kind of to anchor yourself to your environment, avoid things that are destructive, move towards things that are good for survival. And there's this basic thermodynamic trick of survival entails an attempt to know the world beyond. And so to relate what we're talking about, I'm saying that once you take that perspective, the problems of consciousness go away. Like most of the problems we have in consciousness research are kind of manufactured because we insist that other animals might not be conscious or plants aren't conscious. And so then we say, well, what is it that makes us different to them? If you actually take away that imposed, purely a kind of, very associated with the kind of Western perspective that we are, since the Bible, right, we've got humans being the kind of separate to nature. Once you take the other perspective, I think these problems fall away. And this is also a common, or not common, but this is also the case with intelligence. There's a lot of people who argue, and I'm sure the work on plant intelligence. So it's not that James is intelligent and the brain pulls the levers. It's a kind of bottom-up emergent phenomenon.
Fascinating. I'd love to read some of your work about that.
Yeah, I can send you over a paper.
That'd be wonderful. That'd be great.
Yeah.
I mean, psychedelics raises lots of interesting questions about consciousness. People often, after psychedelic experiences, question the more materialistic, brain-based ideas of consciousness. And I think that's interesting in itself. Why should that be? Well, I think it has something to do with this sense of connection we're talking about. And the fact that, well, I don't know exactly why that is, but it's hard not to mess around with psychedelics and not become interested in consciousness. I mean, the experience is so much about it. And also the relativizing of your consciousness, the idea that it doesn't have to be the way it is every day. And that, yeah, we change it every day with caffeine to some extent. We sharpen our consciousness. We're more, more focused. And somewhat, and a slightly different feeling tone from that. But psychedelics suggest that it could be a whole other way to be conscious, and that suddenly you realize that consciousness is not as transparent as you thought it was, and that gets you thinking. I certainly get me thinking. I've been thinking a lot about consciousness since I had these experiences. Haven't figured anything out though. You've figured some stuff out.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. The word transparency is very important there, because that's a term philosophers use for this feature of consciousness that we typically, if things are working normally, we kind of see through it. We don't even notice it. We see an apple in front of us and we say, there's an apple in front of me. We don't say it's a kind of this ephemeral thing appearing in my consciousness. But then you take a psychedelic and suddenly things are melting, and I mean, the question, where is this happening, suddenly becomes very vivid, which might not be something you've ever asked yourself before, as you're kind of using your mind in a task kind of positive way.
Yeah, and the whole idea too that the mind is actually generating perceptions, predictive coding, suddenly seems more real, because you can see the predictions kind of going off in one way or another. So the idea that there's more of an inside out flow of information to perception rather than simply a window bringing stuff in, suddenly you can imagine that the brain is predicting things and is making stuff up, is a great manufacturer of perceptions, not just a receiver of perceptions. And you feel that, I think, on psychedelics. But on the other hand, you also feel like the world is stranger than you thought. So anyway, it's I think there's, I mean, I'm curious to get your take on this, but it seems to me that there is some real potential to understand consciousness by using psychedelics, either in the individual mind of the philosopher or in scientific experiments. And I'm curious to know what you think the potential, what's the connection in your mind between psychedelics and consciousness?
Yeah, my emphasis would be on the first one, in the mind of the philosopher, because I really think when you have the view of ourselves that we're conditioned with, of that the self is something really solid that really exists, and is kind of the be all and end all, and it's a vision of us as these kinds of top down creatures that are really in control. I think that way of seeing the world is delusional, really. If we're going to be kind of firm about it, the kind of spiritual traditions like Buddhism that talk about us seeing the world in a deluded way, I think are accurate. And it's understandable that we evolved to have certain ways of seeing the world that aren't. I mean, almost everything about our perception is off. It's for survival, not for seeing truth. And I think by kind of taking down certain delusions, like the self, you can actually see reality more clearly. So in the case of, I was arguing before, the perspective of seeing us as part of nature, if you're a biologist, I think a lot of questions suddenly make a lot more sense. But then I do think experimentally as well, you could absolutely, there's such interesting phenomena that happen, this work on the neural correlates of consciousness, kind of correlating brain activity to subjective states. It's absolutely, it could fit into that paradigm. I'm not, there's that quote, was it from Stan Grof, about psychedelics being to the study of the mind what the telescope was to the study of the stars.
And the microscope too. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And I don't quite think that about the experimental work, because I think people are doing just fine with the kind of correlations of normal subjective states, and that's hard enough. I mean, I think he's right when it comes to, Groff is in a kind of, Freudian, Jungian depth psychoanalytic tradition. There, I think it is truly revolutionary. I think it's the tool to study that stuff. But when it comes to neuroscience, that's actually not the piece that I find most exciting.
Yeah. Some of the scanning work done, though, of people on psychedelics has been very provocative. I talk in How to Change Your Mind of the work that Robin Carhart Harris did, and identifying the default mode network as one network that was downregulated by the experience, and how suggestive that is, since when they found dramatic drops in default mode network activity is when people reported ego dissolution. And so that correlation, I think, is really interesting. But there's a lot more to be done understanding how the brain appears to be temporarily rewired during psychedelic experience. And then why should it have an enduring effect? Why should a single experience lead to a learning that continues? And whether it's a new narrative about yourself, breaking of an addictive habit, losing your fear of death. I mean, these are big changes that it's hard to imagine a single experience leading to that. Of course, we have the negative example. We have trauma, right? Trauma can change brains. And Roland Griffith has suggested, well, maybe we have to think of this as kind of the obverse of trauma. I mean, that this is a powerful, positive experience that would leave deep tracks in the brain.
Right. I'm actually very interested in your take on the role of science in the kind of psychedelic renaissance, because, again, perhaps surprisingly, as a scientist, I would kind of rather advocate for these things being available rather widely as soon as possible, because I think there are indigenous traditions that know how to kind of handle these substances. And I think the science is good. It's always good, but it's kind of good for from a PR perspective, so people are less worried about the potential risks with these things. But yeah, what's your take of the role of science in when this gets rolled out?
It's interesting. When I wrote How to Change Your Mind, the subject was still a lot less acceptable to mainstream people and publications, and I relied heavily on the science for that reason. I mean, if you wanted to make something credible in our society, you need to have some peer-reviewed science behind it. It's just it's a given. And I didn't talk that much about the underground, and I talked very little about indigenous use. In this new book that I have coming out this summer, I delve into the whole indigenous use with mescaline, or the mescaline-producing cacti. And you're right. I mean, mescaline goes back 6,000 years of being used, presumably in a religious context. So we have long experience as a species, and it's being used in the Native American church as a powerful healing agent. I think that's a fascinating case because it gives us a very constructive and conservative model of drug use. I mean, it's something that we think of drug use as tied to social disruption, hedonism, dulling of pain, self-medication, all the moral categories we put drugs in. But here you have something that psychedelics don't fit into that in many ways. First, it's often hard work. It's not escapist as much as people might think it is. But in this Native American community, it's about group healing. It's about healing, the wounds of colonialism and dispossession, healing alcoholism, family disruption, all this kind of stuff. And it happens in a group, very carefully choreographed ceremony. And it's been remarkably effective on the testimony of, a great many Native Americans. So it kind of forces you to rethink, what is a drug? And maybe we shouldn't put all these substances under that rubric. Maybe that rubric is just meaningless at this point. So anyway, so I've gotten much more interested in the indigenous side. Had I filled How to Change Your Mind with Shamans and Curanderas, you would never have heard of the book. Well, maybe you would have, but many other people would not. So anyway, I was trying to correct that balance a little bit with this new piece.
Yeah, I'm really excited to read that because I think, we have this, obviously, these things being used as medicines is a wonderful, wonderful thing. But there's this risk that, when you look at the history of mescaline containing cacti and their use in America, they were kind of clamped down on so aggressively, and it was so irrational and so kind of purely based in domination, the way, Native American people were treated around that there could be an easy way where people just go, let's not reckon with that. Let's just say we've got this new medicine. We're going to put it through the usual process by which a medicine gets rolled out, and we don't have to think about that. But I think, the wonderful thing with psychedelics is they kind of, not for everyone, but they generally encourage you to look at these kind of grander narratives and the interconnections of things. And I think it's a healthier thing to confront the past traumas that have inflicted there and say, well, actually, this is something that should be promoted and we should reckon with, rather than just kind of run into medicalization.
Yeah, and I think even the people doing clinical research are acutely aware of that. This whole field rests on the back of indigenous wisdom. And the guides are certainly aware of that. You see remnants of indigenous ceremony in the way that drugs are administered. Some people are kind of embarrassed at that, but a lot of people are very respectful about it. And that, and there's active conversations in how do you have some reciprocity about that, or reparations about that. I'm involved with a psychedelics center that's just formed on the Berkeley campus. And, we have conversations about how are we going to, make that recognition explicit? How are we going to make sure that we're including indigenous peoples in what we're doing? And there are companies too. There's a company called Journey Collab that wants to work with mescaline, in fact, to treat alcoholism. Which is a reasonable hypothesis because it's done that for Native Americans. But the Native Americans figured that out. And so they're trying to figure out a way to flow a significant part of their profits or revenues to Native American groups. And we'll see how that all works out. But it's definitely part of the DNA of even the industry. And that's as it should be.
Yeah. Actually, I'm really interested in this center at Berkeley that you mentioned. I'm quite jealous because a few years ago, I was actually a visiting researcher in that same department at Berkeley.
Oh, really?
I wish you guys had been down the corridor at the time. But
well,
yeah, so
what
are you up to there? Yeah, I'd love to.
Yeah, so it's the Berkeley Center for the Science of Psychedelics, and it's kind of a slightly different beast than the other psychedelic centers. We're not doing clinical research. Berkeley, as you know, doesn't have a medical school. That all happens at UCSF across the bay. But we have a really good neuroscience department and a really good psychology department and a pretty good journalism department that I'm attached to. And so we're looking at other things that need to be done as we move into what I see as the next chapter of the psychedelic renaissance. And that is legitimizing these substances in science and in the public, producing, and we want to do basic science around psychedelics, look at issues like predictive coding and how psychedelic, either low dose or high dose psychedelic experience could help us understand that better. So Michael Silver is a neuroscience who studies visual perception. We want to do some imaging too, and we have some very powerful tools for imaging that we'll be using. We want to do training too. That, you know, one of the bottlenecks in the field is going to be lack of trained guides to administer the drugs, whether in a research context or once the drugs are legalized. And we want to figure out ways to optimize training. Should guides be trained in a different way if you're treating addiction than cancer, or, you know, there's a lot of, we haven't validated a lot of what we're doing scientifically around training. And then the third thing is doing some public education. There's a huge amount of curiosity out there and not a lot of good journalism in the field so far. So we'll probably do a podcast, a newsletter, a website with a lot of resources, hold events and dialogues, convene people to discuss things like Proposition 109 in Oregon, and, you know, how that's going to unfold, or some of these issues of indigenous wisdom in the field. And I'll be in charge of that part of it. So altogether, I mean, the where we're moving is, you know, hoping to bring psychedelics into mainstream use and clear up misconceptions about them and keep people informed, while doing hopefully some important basic science. Our scientists have never worked with psychedelics. What's interesting about it is that these are people who establish themselves as very good scientists who want to work with psychedelics, and that we're going to be able to give the opportunity. And we also have cognitive psychologists too, so that perspective too hasn't been brought to bear in the research. So yeah, it's very exciting. We're in the process of raising money, and we've got enough to get started, but we have big ambitions. So we'll see.
And when you talked about the kind of the PR side of things, you write in the book about this phrase that a researcher used of the betterment of well people, in addition to just kind of treating people with serious mental health issues. Is that part of the vision of the center to go with that kind of message?
You know, insofar as we're going to be offering tools to help people integrate psychedelic experience, I mean, we'll be doing it for guides, but we'll also be doing it for people who are doing this on their own and offering, you know, psychedelic experience is in and of itself can be very interesting, but easy to kind of dismiss as a drug experience, right? And people who use the drugs as teenagers often have this feeling, you know, that the drug, you know, the drug made me think all these wild things or gave me these hallucinations. It's only when you integrate the experience carefully, which is to say, discuss it, think it through, apply it to your life, turn it into a narrative, because it's often not a narrative. You know, it can be very jumbled, very chaotic. And it's only in the telling that you begin to make sense of it. And that got short-circuited in a lot of recreational use of psychedelics. So our sense is that people can use the experience more productively or more constructively than they do now. And another way to integrate the experience too is to move into contemplative practice of some kind. And so we're working with people who do a lot of teaching and contemplative practice. I've long thought, and based on my own experience, but also talking to researchers, that psychedelics are a very good way to start a meditation practice, that you get a kind of an idea of the destination. A lot of, we talk about psychedelic experience and we usually focus on the fireworks, the climax, the moment of ego dissolution. But there's a really long tail where you're essentially meditating. You've regained your ability to train your mind on this or that. You're no longer commandeered as you are at some points in the trip, and it can be a very productive meditation because you can block out things and go really deep. And I just found that I became a better meditator having had those experiences and could return to that state of mind. So I think giving people some of those tools after psychedelic trip would be valuable too. But I do foresee a time when people who are not clinically mentally ill have access to psychedelic therapy in the same way they already have access to psychotherapy. You don't need a diagnosis of depression or anxiety necessarily to get psychotherapy. People go when they're unhappy, when they have stresses in their life, when they're marriage breaking up, change in career, all the reasons people seek psychotherapy and get benefit from it, and sometimes from medication. I think in the same way that people will eventually, whether by going to a psychiatrist or going to a clinic where there's a psychiatrist on staff, that they will be able to have access to psychedelic therapy. I also think we will find some of these substances, like MDMA and psilocybin, used in lower doses in talking therapy. I mean, that was something I explored in the history in the 50s. It was called psycholytic therapy, and it was very popular in Los Angeles. And you would basically, go to your shrink and you would get a medium dose of LSD, 60 micrograms up to 100 maybe. And then you'd have your session and your defenses would be down, but you could still sit in a chair and focus on somebody and have a conversation. MDMA was found to be very good for that right up till 1985, and then in the underground. So I do think it'll find its way into psychotherapy and be available to people who are not clinically mentally ill. Yes. I'm hopeful anyway. I mean, I think it has great value.
Yeah.
I mean, we're all, look, we're all on a spectrum. I mean, the whole idea that, you have a DSM diagnosis is it's really an artifact. All of us are depressed sometimes. All of us are anxious sometimes. All of us have issues that we want to work on. And these substances have the potential to help many, many people.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned Oregon. Could you sketch out what's going on there at the moment as we look to the future of these things being more available?
Yeah, so, the world is going through a process of how exactly are we going to integrate these powerful substances into society? And one obvious model is the normal drug approval process, whether it's the FDA or the EMA. And that's certainly being pursued, and corporations and nonprofits are pursuing it right now. And that will probably bear fruit, but that'll leave some people out. And it'll leave the underground out. I mean, this community of underground therapists who actually are, the most skilled therapists, not every single one of them, but there's an enormous amount of wisdom there, of people who've been at this for decades. So there was a couple who were therapists in Oregon, the Eckerts, Tom and Sherry Eckert, who actually, after reading an article of mine in the New Yorker called "The Trip Treatment," thought, we need to legalize this. We can't wait for the FDA. So they started a campaign and managed to get a ballot initiative passed this past November 3rd. That's quite remarkable. It's Proposition 109, and it basically obliges the State Department of Health in the state of Oregon to set up a regulatory body that will do two things. One will be to license growers of psilocybin to create a supply, legal supply, and it will also train and license guides. And this will include, no doubt, many guides who formerly had been underground, and they'd get a certificate. And it will organize a system in which those guides can have access to psilocybin and administer it to people. It doesn't specify people must be mentally ill. It's anyone who seeks this therapy. Now, for this to work is going to take pretty intense cooperation on the part of the politicians. Are they going to be comfortable with this? So far, it looks like the governor is, but it's putting a big burden on a State Department of Health to essentially, run a drug approval process and license this new category of therapists. There's also the concern that how's the federal government going to feel about this? This is really usurping a very important role of the Food and Drug Administration, which is to say drug approval and regulation. Are they going to sit for this? We don't know. The promoters are hoping that the model is what the federal government did when states began decriminalizing or legalizing cannabis. And the federal government under Obama said, we're not going to bust you, unless these experiments get out of control. We're just going to let the states experiment. And they're hoping the same thing will happen here. But there are different institutional imperatives involved. And I could see the FDA having a problem with this. And then there's, what about liability for these therapists? Is there some insurance company that's going to actually insure them against malpractice? Well, they are still breaking federal law. So anyway, there's a whole lot of challenges. I think it's going to be fascinating to watch unfold. I hope it works out and goes smoothly. We often say in the United States that the states are the laboratories of democracy. It's where you try ideas out before you take them nationally. And that certainly was true with cannabis. It was true with assisted suicide, which Oregon also pioneered. So anyway, it's something to watch closely. It's going to be really interesting to watch.
Yeah, absolutely. And so maybe to bring this full circle, in your book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, you're kind of writing about food production and arguing that's the kind of main way we engage with the natural world. Since psychedelics produce this kind of ecological awareness, do you think that they could play a role in shifting us away from kind of problematic industrial modes of food production to more local, sustainable modes?
That's an interesting analogy. I hadn't thought about it. In both cases, it's about taking back control. We gave up control of our diet to large corporations. We no longer understood the lines connecting us to nature through our eating choices. And psychedelics and plant medicines of all kinds are another way that we connect to nature. It's been very interesting to watch for the Native American church that they got kind of disconnected from the plants, which grow only in one small area of Texas. But now they're coming back to the pilgrimage, going to this land, these peyote gardens, harvesting, realizing how much care the plants need and how precious they are because they're really in short supply now. So I like telling stories that connect dots that have been lost. I mean, one of the features of modern industrial or post-industrial society and economy is that we just don't know where anything comes from or how it was made or how it connects us to the natural world. And stories about where your food comes from, 100 years ago, that would be like, the most boring thing imaginable. Everybody knew where their food came from. They had a direct relationship with a farmer or they were a farmer. Now we have no idea. It's just meat is just this shrink-wrapped pile of protoplasm. So ditto with psychedelics. I mean, I think that there's, it's one of the reasons that actually using real mushrooms as opposed to synthetics or real cactus as opposed to synthetics is and tasting it and having that physical experience of ingesting it, which can be difficult, it should be part of the process. And it's a reminder that nature gave us this. And then the questions arise, why? Why was it adaptive for humans to start changing consciousness? It seemed to me it could be, quite maladaptive. You fall off of things. You're more vulnerable to predation. You don't have, your defenses are down, literally. Nevertheless, evolution would have weeded out the drug takers, right, by now, if it was really so maladaptive. And so one of the things I'm very interested in is like trying to figure out, well, what is the value? How do these substances help us? Caffeine is a great example because it's so obvious. It contributed to rational thinking and kind of spotlight consciousness, gave us energy, led to greater productivity. Capitalism loves caffeine. That's why they give people a coffee break. Paid time to ingest a drug. But I think psychedelics have value too, and probably have done more than we know at various points in history to kind of introduce necessary ideas at times of crisis.
Right. Yeah, I don't expect to see a paid DMT break anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, it would work though. You could do it in 20 minutes.
Exactly. Yeah. This has been wonderful. Thanks so much, Michael.
Will you also send me that paper you alluded to?
Yeah. Absolutely.
About your theory of consciousness. I'm intensely interested in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And would you send people to your website or Twitter or somewhere if they want to kind of follow your work more?
Yeah, I think the best thing is my website, michaelpollan.com, or my Twitter feed, which is at Michael Pollan. And I tweet pretty regularly about both psychedelics and food. And on my website, I have a lot of psychedelic resources for people who are interested in learning more. So thank you. And there's information on the new book there, which will be out in July.
Excellent. Look forward to reading it. Thanks again.
Yeah. Thank you, James. Great pleasure to talk to you. Yeah. Stay in touch.
Thanks for listening. If you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. And if you want to help the podcast reach a wider audience, you can leave a review on Apple Podcasts. Finally, if you want to offer financial support, you can go to patreon.com/Dr. James Cook.